I name this ship Queen Elizabeth. May God bless her and all who sail in her.
The first of Britain's new aircraft carriers is now afloat, having been named by the Queen last summer. But the jets that fly off them will arrive in slower time, and that means that the Royal Navy has plans to put its carriers into service with US Marine squadrons on board.
It makes complete sense to my mind to try and to work up the capability, which is not just a ship, it's the people that operate on it, it's the electronic warfare, it's the logistics support, it's the whole demands of operating this very potent capability away from our island shores as an autonomous capability.
It's not clear how many F-35s Britain can afford. It's spoken in the past of 48. But in the last year, all the attention has been on the first production order for 14 planes. In February, Newsnight was told that buy was imminent.
The British taxpayer has invested over £6 billion in building aircraft carriers, and my job is to get the aircraft flying from them, operating from them as quickly as we can, so that this huge additional capability that we will have with these carriers and Joint Strike Fighter can be available and deployable as soon as possible.
As the year went on, though, problems with the software and engines meant that Britain's order was delayed again and again. Then, last month, it finally came, but not the 14 planes that were expected. Just 4 jets were ordered. So will the slower ordering rate delay the F-35's entry into service? Well, some insiders have insisted to us that it will, although the official MOD position is that the first operational carrier squadron will be ready by 2021. But even if that date is met, the aircraft carrier itself will be ready years before that. And it's into that gap that the US Marine Corps squadrons could be put. And other issues are opening up too. The carrier plan dates back to 2010, and Westminster is abuzz with rumours that this blueprint could be torn apart in a new defence review after the election.
Grand design as it was etched out then is already unaffordable, and we know there are going to be serious cuts across the board in Whitehall next year, which will blow that vision further off course. Now, quite how badly, who knows? My guess is that defence will in 2015, as it did in 2010, come off more likely than some departments, but it's certainly not a protected department that's going to get a buy, and therefore more bad news is looming on the horizon.
Both carriers will be built, but could the Royal Navy's long voyage back to a full capability with F-35s able to strike from its decks be halted on its last leg?
At one end, you've got the really hard, cutting-edge, bristling with warfighting capability carrier that has the fast jets on there, able to prosecute in the most dangerous circumstances, difficult warfare. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got carriers that can take helicopters, carry troops around and do humanitarian relief operations. So there's a very big spectrum of capability that you can exploit with a carrier. And I think the decisions that we have to make as a nation is, can we afford to use these carriers at the high end, which carries a significant amount of investment and capability risk, or can we operate them down at the other end with a contingency to operate at the higher end?
All sorts of decisions about getting the carriers into action are now slowing down or frozen in advance of the next defence review. How many jets should be on each ship? How many weapons for them? What type of communications should the ships have? Whether the Navy has enough escorts for them and enough specialist crew like engineers to actually get them all to sea. As these question marks multiply, the Navy is preparing for a fight.
If you look at the output of the American carriers, which have typically 48 to 50 serviceable aircraft on the deck ready to go to achieve the strike missions. Now we can factor that differently for the performance of the F-35. It is a different fighter, different aircraft, but fundamentally we will need enough jets to make those carriers credible as strategic assets.
In this sea of uncertainty, the Navy is preparing one plank of its survival strategy, to invite US planes onto its carriers if Britons aren't ready. That type of thinking hints at how desperate the post-election defence battles might be.
Mark Urban there. Well, General Lord Richards was, for 3 years until last year, Chief of the Defence Staff, otherwise known as Head of the Armed Forces. He's with me now. Good evening to you. And I want to talk to you about more general issues of managing defence. But let's start on those F-35s. How much of a sort of humiliation is it that having waited all this time for the carrier, we're then not going to have planes to put on?
Well, don't forget, as the Air Vice-Marshal made very clear, I thought he spoke very well, it's more than just the top end, the fast jets. So those ships will be very useful from the outset in other missions. I don't think it's a humiliation. I think what we've heard today from Mark's story makes absolute common sense from a military perspective. If there is a delay, and I'm already well out of the detail of this, I, as I'm sure Nick Horton, my successor, is doing, would be encouraging the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force to make virtue of necessity. And if it means that we can catch up by using American aircraft in that intervening period, then that makes absolute sense.
In your book, your recent book, you actually tell a little tale of there were some Harrier jets that would have worked on these carriers, and we were selling all ours to the Americans, but you tried to keep a few aside, just in case we had this kind of eventuality. And Liam Fox discovered you were doing that, and he was Defence Secretary, and he ordered you to sell them straight away, so we had absolutely no chance of using them.
Well, I mean, it was a sort of brave effort to just have something up our sleeve. I mean, I would never have bought the two huge carriers, but we've now got them, and we need to make sure they work. And so I do think what the MOD announced, or what Mark has picked up, does make sense. And not to now use these carriers, I think, would be almost criminal.
But we do seem, decade after decade, to make whopping great mistakes in defence buying, don't we? And every time we say, we've got a new way of doing it now, we're not going to do that anymore. What was the last one? I mean, there've been...
Well, Nimrod probably was a lot. But I mean, first of all, the vast majority of programmes actually work pretty well. And when I arrived at CDS, I was as critical as you are sounding now. And actually, very quickly, it became clear to me, the media and all of us are focused on 2 or 3 every year that go wrong. They're very difficult programmes to synthesise. And again, the Air Vice-Marshal gave an idea for all the things they're trying to bring together. It never really works at that high end in the way that's expected. So the military have to make virtue of necessity, and I think that's what we've heard
That's
today.
what they're doing. OK, let's look into the next Parliament, because on the default settings of this government carrying on with what it's published, you're not the health service, the MOD, so it doesn't get protected. All the non-protected departments basically cut by 22% over the next Parliament. OK, we heard Defence can expect to do a bit better than that, but it's going to be pretty bloody, isn't it? And
well,
I mean, what's going to be left?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's a debate to be had. I mean, since those suggestions were first made, I mean, we've got Ukraine, we've got ISIS, it now spread into Iraq, there's Nigeria, which needs a lot of help. Afghanistan is unfinished business, I would argue. President Obama has just said they're going to do it for a bit longer. We're dealing with Ebola. I think what the next government's got to decide, and I think the jury's out to the next government now, is that consistent with our ambitions, as your lead-in said, and if not, then we better adjust our ambitions. I don't think you can go on having it both ways for much longer.
Right. So the politicians basically have to put up or shut up.
Yes,
I mean, they can't go
so.
Round pretending we're a...
Yeah, I mean, I think all military men want, and many other strategies, is consistency. You can't be a great nation with all the ambitions we've consistently had and keep cutting defence. And our allies won't put up with it either. So I do think that next year becomes key.
We're meant to spend, it's a commitment actually, 2% of our national income on defence. It's a NATO goal, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I think we're going to start failing that next year, aren't we? And that's before we've got into more cuts next year.
Well, I think that would be very difficult for the Prime Minister, because he's just, quite rightly, been encouraging a lot of other nations to do it, and then for us not to would be a little hypocritical. So I am hopeful that there's a debate to be had, and we may yet find that we do the right thing. But all we really want is to be consistent, either put up or shut up. Yeah. And I think, there's nothing I or other people can then complain about.
I wonder whether the politicians, whether the Prime Minister gets it, that he's talking up on the one side what we can do and not not resourcing it?
Well, read the book. I sat on the National Security Council, and I absolutely clear they do understand it, but they're in a bind. Economically, the country still needs to make savings, and where do you find them? And it's quite right that people like the Chancellor of the Exchequer should give people like me a hard time to prove my arguments are sound. But I do think come next year, and we do know the Prime Minister's personally committed not to making a cut, then we're reaching crunch time, and we will know whether you're right or not.
I mean, one of the choices I suppose we have to make is whether I think it's put as a full spectrum military, or you become a specialist force. And is that how you'd do it? If you had to get much more out, you just say, look, we're not going to try and do everything. We'll have our little niche, and that's what we'll do.
I think it would be quite a big niche. Don't forget, we are still the second most effective fighting force across the board in NATO. I don't think anyone actually gainsays that. But if you had a major cut, the sort of thing you're talking about, and I suspect it would be between 7 to 10% actually, you would probably have to roll specialised. And given the commitment we have made to the maritime capability, Trident, the carriers, astute submarines, which you need to defend the carriers and the Trident, I think that's where we'd end up putting our money. And the army would be smaller, and the Air Force would undoubtedly suffer as well.
If we chose not to replace Trident, you could have a bigger army, presumably. I mean, that would be the sort of trade-off, bigger Air Force and army, and you would...
Yes, that's if you believe that the politicians wouldn't actually take that money still, because that's what they'd have to do to balance the books in other ways. But I suppose those who argue that Trident could be cut would argue that that means there'd be more money for other capabilities. I'm not certain that's a proven argument, and although it's a lot of money, I'm not certain it would be sufficient actually over the 20 to 30 years that we're talking about.
Would you put Trident replacement as one of the priorities, though? I mean,
Now, you probably won't get many ex-chiefs of defence, and certainly no serving chief of defence, who'd say that they don't believe that Trident is necessary. So I'm not going to fall into that trap, but good go.
But it's been likened, hasn't it? It's been said that we'll be like a country with quite a small military, but with one whopping great weapon. It'll be like Belgium with nuclear weapons.
Belgium with nukes.
Belgium with nukes.
Yeah.
Does it make sense militarily to be a country?
No, certainly not. But I think we're a long way from that. We really are. I mean, whilst, you could paint a picture that leads to that without too much difficulty over the next 20 to 30 years, I really wouldn't want to suggest to anyone listening or watching that is the trap we'd like to fall in the near term.
But your book actually makes clear that you think the enemy isn't the Russians, right? I mean, I don't think Putin is in the index, whereas Al-Qaeda and ISIS are in the index.
I do think they're the biggest threat because they don't recognise any rules and they can attack you from within. I would like to see, and it wouldn't be easy, an accommodation with Russia, as I would, and I'm very much in favour of what President Obama's doing with Iran, for example. I think states work better together when they're properly sort of understood, and I don't really trust organisations like ISIS to do the right thing. I think they're in a different league.